Hello Biology 1 students! We are going to learn about microorganisms this week. The name microorganisms just means small living things, and microorganisms come in two different varieties, two different styles. There are prokaryotic microorganisms, which include things like bacteria, and then there are eukaryotic microorganisms, and that includes cells that are small but have organelles, so things like algae will be a good example of something that's in that category. So as we get ready to head into this chapter, I'm planning to try giving you this chapter sort of more in the style that we're used to. I'm going to be writing notes by hand, and you'll be able to see those notes, and you should have your own paper and pencil and take notes as we go. So kind of the same style that we've been accustomed to back when we were in person. I'd write on the whiteboard and you'd copy things down. We're going to try doing that again now, even though we're online. So as we get into this, chapter 15, again, this is all about microorganisms. And microorganisms are extremely important. They're pretty much everywhere. Anywhere that you look, there's bound to be a microorganism. Even if you can't see them, they're too small to see with the naked eye, but they really do exist all over the place, including in and on our own bodies. They're extremely important for maintaining our health, actually. Most microorganisms are very beneficial to have around. About 2 to 5 pounds of your own body weight is actually due to microorganisms that live in you or on you. So they are significant in terms of their contributions and also just how many of them there are. So very important for our health. What we're going to do is start with the prokaryotes. Prokaryotic microorganisms come in two varieties, prokaryotes. And just as a reminder, prokaryotic cells do not have organelles. So very different internal structure from what we're used to thinking about with eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes don't have those same internal structures. So they do have DNA. The DNA is just floating sort of freely in the cytoplasm instead of being housed in a nucleus. So again, prokaryotes, let's list out these two different categories. Prokaryotes, two different types. Bacteria are one type. And then there's another category called Archaea, archaeal cells. They're similar to bacteria, but they live in different sorts of conditions. So let's start with the bacteria. Bacteria are a little bit more familiar to us. Bacteria, so I'd just like to particularly note with bacteria, sometimes when we hear this word we think, oh, bacteria is bad, that's why we wash our hands to get rid of bacteria. Most bacteria though are good. It's just a few, a small subset are potential problems, and that's why it is important to wash our hands, one of the reasons why. So with bacteria, most are beneficial or harmless. Most are harmless or beneficial. And there are really just a few that are capable of causing disease or problems in the body. A few cause disease. If they cause disease or are capable of causing disease, they are referred to as pathogens. So pathogens, some bacteria are pathogens, but not all bacteria are pathogens. Some viruses are pathogens as well. And so this word pathogen means it's something that can cause disease. All right, when a pathogen population gets out of control in our bodies, that's when there is a problem. That's when we would become ill. And we're going to put a couple of examples down for this. When a pathogen population gets out of control, in our bodies, we become ill. Okay, and a good example of this in the context of bacteria is food poisoning. So if you've ever had food poisoning, it's not pleasant. It's very unpleasant. If you've never had food poisoning, that's a good thing. It is not fun. So food poisoning is a great example of this. And the reason that food poisoning can happen is because pathogenic bacteria produce toxins, and those toxins are problematic. They're an issue when they build up in the body. So the way that they cause disease, let me just put kind of a side note down here. The way that they cause disease is by producing some type of a poison, actually. They produce a poison. And poisons come in different varieties. There are different types. The two that we are going to make note of here are called exotoxins and endotoxins. Exotoxins, so this word exo, prefix exo, this is referring to something that's outside. Exotoxins, these are toxins that the pathogen can produce and then secrete into the surroundings. So it's something that it's not like it's part of the bacteria, rather it's something that the bacteria produces and secretes into its surroundings. So exotoxins, literally what they are is proteins. They're just proteins that the bacteria makes, pathogenic bacteria make. Proteins secreted by pathogenic bacteria. And a good example of this, of an exotoxin, is what happens in certain types of food poisonings. There are different causes of food poisoning that can happen, but one possibility is if there are high levels of Staphylococcus aureus. This is a bacteria that produces an exotoxin, and the exotoxin causes our bodies to have vomiting and diarrhea, which is extremely unpleasant and can be serious. If it goes on for too long, then we can get dehydrated, which leads to other problems. So example here that I'm going to list is Staphylococcus aureus. This is a bacteria, S. aureus, and it can cause food poisoning. Okay, so in this particular example, it's the exotoxins that the bacteria produces. Those exotoxins cause the symptoms of food poisoning. They cause vomiting and diarrhea. And an interesting note about this type of food poisoning. So sometimes, I don't know if you've ever done this, but sometimes I hear of people like they have old food in the fridge and they're not sure if it's still good or if maybe it's gone bad, and they don't want to waste it. So what they do is they take it out of their fridge and they re-cook it. They heat it back up to like 165 degrees. And then they think, oh, okay, now it's safe because I've recooked it. The problem with that logic is that cooking it doesn't remove these exotoxins. So it might kill the bacterial cells that are present, but it's not actually removing the exotoxins. So food poisoning is unfortunately still a possibility even in that case. So old food, it's best just to get rid of it and start fresh. Endotoxins, let's put a couple of notes about them. Endotoxins, on the other hand, endotoxins are actually components of the bacteria itself. So the bacteria has a plasma membrane, just like our cells do, a plasma membrane, and then oftentimes they have a cell wall around that. And sometimes there's a molecule built in to that outer structure of the bacteria, and that component can be the thing that causes problems for us internally. So it's not a separate molecule that's being secreted, rather it's actually part of the bacteria itself. So that's called an endotoxin. This is a component of the outer membrane of certain bacteria. Okay. All right, so again, the symptoms that can result are very similar. It's just being caused by a slightly different type of toxin. With endotoxins, these also can induce symptoms such as fever, aches, sometimes even, in extreme cases, sometimes septic shock, which is like a widespread, this means the bacteria is present in circulation in the body, and it's an infection that is widespread, and this is a very serious condition. Septic shock, let me just scroll and we'll say a little bit more about that. Septic shock. Okay, what this is referring to specifically, the result of this is that the blood pressure, our blood pressure, drops dangerously low. So we need to have blood pressure up at a certain level in order to maintain our own bodies. If the blood pressure goes too low, then we're not going to be getting blood out to all of the areas that it needs to go. So septic shock, this is a dangerous drop in blood pressure. And example to go along with this one, example. E.g. example. Okay, bacterial meningitis. Bacterial meningitis. The meninges are the coverings on our brain and spinal cord. It's a protective covering. Meningitis is referring to an inflammation of those protective coverings. So inflammation, this is something that can be caused by bacteria, and specifically endotoxins of bacteria. So bacterial meningitis is a good example. And this is a condition that it can be deadly very quickly if it is not brought under control, if it is not treated. This can be deadly. Okay, and then another example, kind of a less extreme example, is other types of food poisoning. So food poisoning by salmonella. Salmonella poisoning is another example of an endotoxin having its effects. Salmonella food poisoning. Okay, so food poisoning comes up in both of these categories as a possible outcome. In either case, it is not pleasant at all. I don't recommend it. Okay, let's see here. All right, so just in terms of let's come back up to the top here. I want to put a couple of notes for Archaea, archaeal cells. They're a little bit different style. I'll just get a different color for this so it's separate. Okay, so Archaea. Archaea are the other type of prokaryotic cells that are microscopic. And archaeal cells have some special characteristics. I think we can probably fit these notes in up here. I'm just going to use this space. Okay, so special characteristics. Special characteristics of archaeal cells. Okay, so basically, the big idea with archaeal cells is that they can live in conditions where other cells cannot. So they can live in really extreme conditions, and they tend to be quite abundant. They are abundant where few other organisms can survive. Okay, 3 examples of Archaea, 3 different categories of archaeal cells. We will list them out right here. The Thermophiles, if you think about this name, Thermophiles, Thermophiles are, let me make that clearer. Thermophiles are very interesting. Thermophiles are organisms that that enjoy heat, or they are okay in heat. The ending of this name, philes means to love, so these are heat-loving cells. Thermophiles live in very hot water. So a good example of this would be down on the ocean floor next to an ocean vent. There's literally boiling water coming up out of the ocean vent, and the thermophiles do just fine in those conditions. They can live and survive. They have special proteins that don't denature in those high temperature conditions. So ocean vents, let me finish my sentence here, where the water is boiling. Okay, thermophiles. Another category of archaeal cells would be the halophiles. Halophiles do well in salty conditions. They enjoy or they like being in salty conditions. Halophiles live in salty conditions instead of hot conditions. So salty conditions, where would that come up? So things like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea. These are places where salt concentration is just way over the top compared to where most things live. So halophiles. And then last category, these are very important, the methanogens. Methanogens live in places where there is no oxygen, so they're able to live without oxygen. Live in anaerobic conditions. This is a word we learned about back in the cellular respiration chapter. Anaerobic conditions, this means there's no oxygen. And what they do, the reason that they are named like they are, is that these cells produce methane as a waste product. So methane production, produce methane as a waste product from their metabolism. Okay, so the methanogens, these are actually responsible for a lot of sort of characteristic smells. A few examples of locations where methanogens are very prevalent. They live in swamps, so swamp gas. Swamp gas is produced by methanogens. More familiar example would be just intestinal gas that we all have. It's not actually you, it's the archaeal cells that live in you. Intestinal gas in people as well as in animals. Intestinal gas in people and animals. So the smell of a dairy, when you drive by a dairy, that methane is produced by archaeal cells. Okay, all right. So next up, what we're going to be doing is going into some sort of different characteristics of prokaryotic microorganisms. What I would like to do is just come back down here. Let me get back to my normal color. Let's come back down here, and just by way of really making it clear in your notes, so we already know from previous chapters that prokaryotic cells don't have organelles. I want to just make sure that that is down in your notes, that you are aware of that. So these cells that we are talking about lack organelles. Prokaryotic cells lack organelles, so they do not have organelles, at least not in the same way that eukaryotic cells do. Another thing that's characteristic about them is that they have a cell wall, and that's something our cells do not have. Right? We have a plasma membrane, but not a cell wall. Almost all prokaryotes have a cell wall, and that's in addition to a plasma membrane. But the cell wall exists outside of a plasma membrane. Okay, we'll be looking at a number of different examples of cells as we proceed through this chapter. Some cells have flagella, which allow them to be mobile. So some prokaryotes are mobile, others are not. Kind of a mixed bag there. A lot live in clusters, and actually let's write this one down. So some live in more of a colony form as opposed to individual cells. May live in an organized colony. And this gets kind of interesting because if they live in an organized colony, they can sort of have different cells assigned to different jobs. So it's almost like they start to get a little bit specialized. This organized colony is called a biofilm. Maybe you've heard of biofilms before. Biofilms are in all of us, in our mouths. Plaque. Plaque is an example of a biofilm. Example, dental plaque. Okay. All right, so we're going to end this video here. We're not done with the chapter, but that's just kind of a good breaking spot. Next up, we'll be looking at different forms that these cells can come in.